Hey everyone, Charles here. What you're about to hear is a presentation I was honored to give at the 2025 Historic Preservation Summit in Lancaster, Pennsylvania last month in September. And I wanted to share this with all of you because it's different than some of the talks that I've given in the past. Most have been condensed versions of the material I've already covered in the podcast. So my thinking was, why include them here in the podcast, given that most of you have already heard what I've had to say? And I'm not really saying anything new or you haven't heard me say already. But what I did here at the invitation, the kind invitation of the Historic Preservation Trust of Lancaster County, is to look at the incidents I covered in the first season of the podcast, Conestoga Town, but through a slightly different lens, and that of historic preservation, and specifically the dilemma around doing historic conservation, historic preservation, when there are no things, buildings, structures, or any of the other sorts of artifacts that are usually the purview of historic preservation. And in this talk, I try to make the point that if historic preservation is really going to include all of the cultures and histories that have been part of the historic landscape, both literally and figuratively, we're going to have to find new tools, both literally and figuratively, and more importantly, new ways of thinking. One quick note is that I've started to upload my episodes to YouTube, and while this podcast is usually an audio-first experience, this presentation I gave included visuals. I suggest looking up the podcast on YouTube for the full experience. So without any further ado, here's what I had to say a few weeks ago in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to the members of the historic preservation community there. Hey, good afternoon. My name is Charles Stewart. I am the host and producer of a podcast called It's Not History. And I'd like to talk to you today about a subject that Danielle and I have been discussing for a while now, which is how to do historic preservation when there is no thing to preserve. Let me kind of give you some background as to how I came up with this idea and how I got here, how I got to this place. So about a year ago, I launched a series in my podcast about a subject that had always puzzled and intrigued me since I was a kid growing up here in Lancaster, and was exposed to the legacy and the lore of this incident that occurred here in Lancaster in 1763 and is generally known as the Massacre of the Conestoga. And one of the things that kind of surprised me when I was researching this series in Lancaster was this discrepancy, this void in the physical preserved historical record. And as I discovered, this wasn't an accident. And this presents a challenge to doing or even thinking about doing any kind of equitable historic preservation. Because on one side is a wealth of information and artifacts, and on the other are almost no things to help you preserve and understand the culture of the Conestoga Susquehannock Native Americans and other Native Americans here in Pennsylvania, which I think is both necessary and doable. But how to do that? And I think there's a number of helpful examples to help us get started there. And I thought that while many of you probably have some understanding of the communities and the incidents and the time frames at the center of this story, I thought it might be helpful to give you a brief refresher course on that, if this is okay. So let's dive in. This story starts with a group of Native Americans known as the Susquehannocks being resettled by William Penn on a 15,000 acres, I know it says 16 there, grant known at the time as Conestoga Manor, which is in present-day Manor Township and also the site of Millersville University, which would be to the top right of this contemporary map from the early 1700s. And when the Susquehannocks were settled there, the residents of this town, this community, became known as the Conestoga Susquehannocks. And William Penn did this because he was that guy. He was a Quaker, genuinely dedicated to creating what he called a peaceable kingdom in the New World, on the land grant he was given here in the New World, and treating the Indians who lived there fairly and equitably. And Penn recognized that the Susquehannocks were having a rough time of it. They had been decimated and dispersed, forced out of their ancestral homeland along the Susquehanna River. And he also did this because he was the largest non-royal landholder anywhere in the British Empire. 29 million acres of Penn's Sylvania. And so William Penn, Quaker, and William Penn, real estate guy, landlord. Both can be true. And so Penn, proprietor and landlord, needed the Susquehannocks in Pennsylvania to maintain a claim to the mouth of the Susquehanna River and to provide navigation to the Chesapeake Bay, against a competing claim by Charles Calvert, the third Baron Baltimore, proprietor of Maryland. Because Penn had signed a treaty with the Susquehannock years earlier, granting Penn that land and those rights. However, Calvert's response was, that land is ours. Your treaty with the Susquehannocks is a sham because they're all dead. Everyone knows they're dead. To which Penn could now point to the very alive Susquehannocks living on Conestoga Manor and go, you mean these dead Indians? And spoiler alert, this will be a reoccurring theme. And for several generations after this, Conestoga Town was a vibrant community, a crucial node on both native and settler diplomatic networks. But by 1763, after the French and Indian Wars and Pontiac's uprising, most of the native inhabitants of Conestoga Town had dispersed back into Indian country and across a line that was held and enforced by the British Army. North of Conestoga Town, along the Susquehannock, along the border between the European settled parts and the native communities to the west, Scots-Irish settlers had formed a community there called Paxton, near present-day Harrisburg. The Pennsylvania Assembly in Philadelphia had authorized the settlers during the French and Indian Wars to form a militia, and to do this for defensive purposes. But in the summer of 1763, during Pontiac's uprising, these settlers went on the offensive, attacking native communities upstream, north and west, along the Susquehannock. And then, for reasons we will probably never fully understand, members of the Paxton militia changed direction and went south and east into the settled territory of Lancaster County. And on the morning of December 14th, 1763, they rode into Conestoga Town and murdered everyone they found. And then they rode home, leaving 6 mangled bodies behind them in deep, blood-soaked snow. The magistrate of Lancaster, Edward Shippen, then assembled the survivors of Conestoga Town into the county workhouse in the city of Lancaster for their protection. It didn't work. On December 27th, 1763, while Shippen and the other notables of Pennsylvania and Lancaster sat in the pews of St. James Church on Orange Street, another larger group of men from Paxton walked down Prince Street, not far from where we are now, and walked into the workhouse and butchered the 14 men, women, and children who remained there. There were no survivors this time. The murderers then walked out the front door and walked back up King Street, got on their horses, and rode home for dinner. No one was ever arrested, let alone charged, let alone convicted, even though everyone knew where to find them, which was Paxton. So this is the Cliff Notes version of what is a much, much, much larger story, a story that takes a full 22 episodes of my podcast. And it is not just me talking, it is a number of people who are experts on the subject, academics, historians, archaeologists, and members of the Native American community, members of the Conestoga Susquehannock. So if you'd like to know more, I'd encourage you to give it a listen. But back to my surprise and my discovery while I was researching this in Lancaster, this discrepancy and void in the physical preserved historical record, which I discovered, again, is not an accident. Let's take Paxton. The church there, and this is a photo I took just a year or two ago. The church there is one of the oldest, maybe the oldest Presbyterian church in America. The building is lovingly maintained and restored, along with the cemetery next to it, where there are many early members of the community who are memorialized. This is the memorial plaque outside of the entrance to the Paxton Church Cemetery. So while I should point out that we don't know for certain any of the names of any of the men who participated in the murders in Conestoga Town and Lancaster, we can be pretty sure that if we went back in time, if we got a time machine, went back in time and took roll call at the door of the workhouse in Lancaster on December 27th, 1763, many of the names venerated here would be on both lists, including, full disclosure, mine. This is the grave of Mary Stuart in the Paxton Cemetery, who was, as you can tell from the date, was a contemporary of the men of the Paxton militia. But complicity aside, there is a deep, rich, preserved cultural history and continuity here. Plenty of things remain to remind people in the 21st century of the legacy and continuity of the Paxton community. Now let's compare that with the preserved history of the Conestoga Town community. There are no things. As I discovered, and this isn't really an accident, it stems largely from a perpetuated and pervasive extinction myth that has distorted the lived reality of Native Americans for generations, and to this day. And that is the myth that they are all gone. Nothing there, nothing to see. And the Native American historian of Native American history at Yale, Ned Blackhawk, in a very good book he wrote a couple of years ago, wrote that the issue with the study of Native American history has been that sees these as separate history, and it foregrounds indigenous elimination as the defining aspect of Native American history. Indigenous scholars, however, have responded by emphasizing survival rather than elimination, and that their histories are and remain interwoven. And this has been one of my North Stars when making the series about the Conestoga, and the realizing that focusing on and perpetuating elimination narratives have real effects. And full disclosure, when I started making the Conestoga Town series, I was fully guilty of starting to perpetuate that myth. It was going to be a story about how sadly the last of the Conestoga Susquehannocks died in Lancaster, which is just complete bullshit, which I discovered to be the case when I started meeting and talking to members, actual members of the Conestoga Susquehannock community. Spoiler alert, they're not all dead, still around, even have an Instagram account. And this elimination myth that there are no Indians or we can't find them is and has been pervasive from the time of the Baron of Baltimore right up until now. I'll give you an example. In 1940, the Pennsylvania legislature introduced a bill that would recognize the Conestoga Susquehannock tribe. The bill was introduced by lineal descendants of the Conestoga Susquehannocks and their supporters. The bill passed both houses of the legislature unanimously, not a single nay vote. Imagine that today. The bill got to the desk of the governor, who admitted that he knew nothing about Indians, so he asked the advice of the state historian in Harrisburg, who said, well, everyone knows they're all dead, massacred by the Paxtons. And so he, the governor, vetoed the bill. And largely because of that and things like it, Pennsylvania today is one of only a handful of states that recognizes no Native American groups. California recognizes about 140, New York State just north of you, a couple dozen, and even Delaware, little Delaware, barely a state, has two tribes that it recognizes, Pennsylvania has 0, because everyone knows they're all dead. And this trend continues until now. In 2014, the National Park Service attempted to apply an indigenous cultural landscape approach, a methodology that had been successful in the West, to the new Captain John Smith Chesapeake National Historic Trail in the East. Putting aside for a second the fact that one boat trip by one English guy who sailed up the Susquehanna once and who then pissed off back to England, never to return, that this somehow merits commemoration by a whole national park, while largely ignoring the countless boat trips made by countless Native Americans over tens of thousands of years. Putting that aside, the authors of this study did try. Quote, "This project was conceived to better understand and map the resources of the contact period landscape of the lower Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania and Maryland, with 2 goals in mind: to assist the National Park Service and its implementation of the segment plan for the Captain John Smith National Historic Trail, and to test the application of indigenous cultural landscape approach in the lower Susquehanna." Okay, good so far. Meetings were held to identify the scope of the project, discuss criteria for the application of the indigenous cultural landscape, develop maps, identify potential interpretive ideas and locations, and the project outcome would include the mapping of the contact period landscape, correlated with soil fertility, topography, stream location, and with lesser confidence contact period trails. The study, they write, also has limitations, which were the opportunity to consult with descendants of Native American communities. But here's the kicker. There was a lack of opportunity to consult with descendant communities. What does that even mean? It means, once again, that nobody can find the Indians. Must not be here. Great attention in the study was paid to the soils of this cultural landscape, but the actual cultures of this cultural landscape, not so much. And look, my point is in calling this out isn't to point fingers or mock the National Park Service, an institution I love dearly, or clutch pearls about how sad it is that we have disrespected the Indians. But instead, what I want to say is that we, as people interested in preserving and promoting the understanding of culture and history, we need to do better when it comes to this culture and legacy. Okay, awesome. Easy to point out a problem, but how do we think about going about solving it? So how? How to do preservation when there is no thing left? How do we correct this blind spot and help people see something that, for all intents and purposes, isn't there anymore? That was there, but is now gone or altered to the point of being largely invisible. So I discovered one possible strategy entirely by accident, literally in my backyard, or more precisely, my wife's family's backyard, just outside Tokyo. When earlier this year, we explored doing some work on the property. And we hired a surveyor who told us that he could probably get approval to do the work that we were thinking of. But first, we'd have to hire an archaeologist. Why an archaeologist, I asked? And the answer came back: because of the castle. And my response was, wait, what castle? And as it turns out, the property sits on the site of a medieval castle, obviously Japanese medieval castle. Most of the neighborhood, in fact, sits on this castle. And in fact, the steep hill next to the house isn't a hill, it's a rampart, one of the outer earthen fortifications of this castle. Features and landscape that were very much there at one time, but are now rapidly disappearing, which, as we'll see in a second, isn't an accident. And this is a contemporary medieval map of the area with the outer fortifications where my family's house now sits to the far left. And it gives you some sense of the multiple layers of fortification and the intricacies that were there. and in some cases still are there. So here's the issue, or the scale of the issue, which is huge. This is a photo of the site, the castle, just taken just after the Second World War. And there in the middle, in the hilly forested terrain, which isn't a hill or a forest, it's the remains of Negiuchi Castle, and Negiuchi Shiro, which was a Yamashiro, Yama meaning mountain and Shiro meaning fort, which means, meaning that the fortifications, moats and ramparts, etc., were carved out of an existing hillside. And the road running horizontally across the frame, called the Mido Kaido. And the Kaido were a system of roads. It's the Japanese version of the Appian Way, strategic roads to move goods and, armies if necessary across the empire. So build a fort on a strategic road and your clan is in the game, controlling and taxing everything that goes up and down. Great place for a fort. But here's the castle several decades later on the right. The difference is that bisecting the castle is the new Japan Route 6, connecting Tokyo with the northern coast. Everything on the north side of the road was developed, and most traces of the catch sold as cultural landscape, destroyed. But not so in the south, where the family home is in the right corner. That part was slower to develop. So in the 90s, the community seized the opportunity to document, interpret, and preserve what remained. And it turns out quite a lot remained. And so what had been gullies and hillocks were now understood to be the bucolic remains of a very different, very violent past, now transformed into a nature area. And so the evolution of what was a very lethal landscape into something that acknowledges, embraces, but also transcends that. The stream, again, was rerouted to fill in what had been moats, recreating not a lethal landscape of the Warring States or of Japan, but now a rich wetland. So this is great. But what about when you need to imagine more than just a few buildings or a few acres? And to see something in a way that you've never really imagined it before, because there's no guides there for you. There's no ramparts or moats. How do you do that? Enter Christo and Jean-Claude. Christo and his wife and artistic partner Jean-Claude loved wrapping things. They started out their artistic career by wrapping chairs, and by the time they were done, they were wrapping entire landscapes and entire buildings. And the goal of this was not just to provide aesthetic joy and beauty, which it does, but a new experience, a new way of seeing the familiar. And one of their largest, most epic works happened not far from where I am right now, north of San Francisco, where in 1976 they built their largest art piece, maybe the largest anyone has ever created, the running fence. And this work was a veiled nylon fence, 18 feet high and 27.5 miles long. It ran across 2 counties, Marin and Sonoma, and it ran all the way from Highway 101 in the east, crossed 14 roads, 59 ranches, and then entered the Pacific Ocean south of Bodega Bay. It took 5 years of planning, 18 public hearings, and an environmental impact report that ran over 400 pages. And throughout the planning process, this project was widely ridiculed until it was actually built. At which point, most everyone had to admit it was spectacular, joyous and beautiful. And it helped people see the monotone ranchland of California in a new way. This fence, by the way, like all their work, is designed to be ephemeral. It remained in place for 14 days, and it was then dismantled, leaving no trace. So why am I bringing this up? Because while their work is whimsical and ephemeral and deeply conceptual, and helps people see landscapes in new ways, seeing things in new ways can actually produce results. And in 1995, they produced a work called Wrapped Reichstag, Project for Berlin. And this is generally considered their most spectacular and successful achievement. The Reichstag, as many of you know, was set on fire in 1933. It was the Capitol building, the Parliament building for Germany, for the newly unified Germany of the 19th century. And in 1933, this arson was used by the Nazi Party as a pretext for suspending Parliament and instituting martial law across Germany, with results that we all know about. After the war, the building survived, but sat unused and certainly unloved. Until Christo draped the entire building in 100,000 square meters of silver fabric, draped the building with this and fastened it all with blue rope. And sure, this is dramatic and pretty. But more importantly, it allowed Germans to imagine not just this building in a new way, but also their nation in a new way, their new unified Germany in a new way. Because it allowed them not just to preserve the past and acknowledge and embrace it, most importantly, they used it as a launching point for this new reunified Germany. Because this is only a few years after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the beginning of German unification. And in the search for a new unified capital, the Reichstag, it wasn't even on the list. And after this, the German government, working with the British architect Norman Foster, revitalized the building, building a new glass dome, replacing the old dome, and putting in an entirely modern infrastructure. But importantly, keeping and acknowledging its very complicated past. On the roof are still shell holes where the SS took a last stand before being defeated by Soviet soldiers, and they are still there untouched, as well as the graffiti that those Soviet soldiers etched onto the wall. But here's the thing. All these projects were done by carefully applying for permits, going through official channels, doing 400-page environmental impact reports, and then getting permission from the same officials, usually a lot of white men. But what if the officials, the white men, won't give you permission or even recognize your existence because you are not a white man? What then? So you don't ask permission, you just take it and make it. So just a few years before Christo built his fence in bucolic Marin, south of there, on the less than bucolic island of Alcatraz, on the evening of November 20th, 1969, the lone guard watching over the infamous but now shuttered federal prison sent a panicked radio call to the Coast Guard. "Mayday, Mayday," he called. "The Indians have landed." What actually had happened was that a boat carrying 14 Native Americans, armed only with paint, had landed on the island. And eventually, more than 400 Native Americans from various tribes across California would join them, establishing a temporary Native community and occupying the island to demand recognition of Native American rights. And the occupation lasted only for a few months and ended mostly peacefully by the spring of 1970. But it did produce visible results, tangible results. It had a direct effect on federal Indian policy and established a precedent for Native American activism and increased the state, local, and federal level recognition at the state, local, and federal level for the Native American community. So much so, in fact, that Spiro Agnew, Richard Nixon's later disgraced vice president, came out publicly in support of Native American rights. And he, not a flaming liberal, or bleeding heart by any stretch of the imagination. And this incident has an interesting and unexpected as historic preservation footnote, by the way. So it's kind of an aside. About 10 years ago, a friend of mine who was the landscape architect with the National Park Service in San Francisco told me about a dilemma they had. because Alcatraz, which is now part of the Golden Gate National Park, had a water tower that was badly in need of being repaired and restored. But the issue they had was that there was graffiti on it that was left by the Native American activists, which had been untouched for the better part of 50 years. But the water tower was going to need to be resealed and repaired and repainted in any scenario, but what to do about the graffiti? The decision was made that this graffiti was part of the history of the place, another fold in the long fabric of its history. And so the National Park Service, being the Park Service, very carefully matched the original paint color and then meticulously stenciled out the outlines of the original graffiti. And then they invited the original activists and their descendants to come back and paint it in again. So what you see today is something between preservation and simulation. But the message remains highly visible and is going to remain that way probably for a long time. But back to us, back to our dilemma of how to preserve when there is no thing left to preserve. And I'd like to throw out a couple thoughts and then invite your thoughts and discussion. Here is one thought. On the Fruitful Pike is a Home Depot. It's about a 10-minute drive from where you are. And in aisle 7, bay 13, you will find, I'm not saying this is the right thing to do, but it is a thing. It is something. Don't you love how a guy sitting comfortably, safely behind his desk a continent away, is proposing you all go out and commit felony trespass on his behalf? Which, to be clear, he is not doing. Do not start tagging Manor Township unless, you really want to. But do not do that. So while I'm not necessarily suggesting that we break the law, I am saying that to correct this multi-generational malfeasance, we need to break the rules and imagine something different and make it happen, because what we have been doing and the rules we have been following have not worked. And I think we can find a better way to recognize and preserve the cultural legacy of the first Pennsylvanians in general, and specifically the community of Conestoga Town and the survivors and descendants of that community, and break the chain that is this myth of they're all gone. Everyone knows they're all gone. And just because that there are no things that are obviously left there to preserve, it doesn't mean that there is nothing that can't be done about it. Because I believe there is, and I hope you do too. So thanks for your time today. Hey friends, Charles again. A few bits of housekeeping before I let you go. As many of you probably notice, I don't tend to do this podcast on a regular weekly schedule. One of the things I discovered is that to do the kind of material that I think I'm good at and that I hope you value takes a lot of time. It takes time for me, a lot of time for me to wrap my head around the topic and then do research and then interview people and then, most importantly, figure out what the story is, what is interesting, what's new, what's revealing, what makes me and hopefully you go, wait, what? And that, I want to share with all of you, my listeners, and that I think makes it worth your time. And to be honest with you, some of the stories don't make the cut. There are a lot of projects that I start to work on only to decide this is interesting. But, I just don't want to recite historical incidents and facts that you probably all know about or that other people have covered someplace else. I want to give you something better, more worthy of your time and mine, and I want it to be a story that I can relate to in some way because it's something that I once thought about in one way and now think about differently, like the Conestoga tribe, or have literally discovered in my backyard, like Negauchi Castle. So thanks very much for listening and for your patience while this work continues on my next series, where I'm going to pick up one of the central themes of Conestoga Town, but in a time and a place that for me was completely unexpected. So I think it fits the bill of something that's both familiar and new and not history. and I hope to have it in front of you very soon. Last, thanks to all of you who've put comments on the website or reached out via email and shared your questions and comments. And a special thanks to all of you who've shared your experiences, materials, and in some cases, your original writing and research to encourage me with your ideas to continue my research into new topics that I can bring to all of you. Also, thanks to all of you who call me out when, maybe I go a little too far with some of my pronouncements or I just plain get the facts wrong. It happens. Thanks for keeping me honest, and please keep it coming. You can reach me at charles@itsnothistory.com. And an extra special thanks to those of you who have taken the time out of your busy schedules to come and see me whenever I have given presentations. I gave a presentation several weeks ago, and just before the lecture, there was a thunderstorm of absolutely biblical proportions. So those of you who came out to see me literally risked life and limb to do. So thank you very much. Because, making a podcast is a really weird, one-sided thing. I write stuff, I read stuff, I record stuff, and then I push it out to the ether, not really knowing what's going on out there with all of you. So being able to have a real dialogue and discussion and put faces to names is really a thrill and makes all this monastic work worth it. So I hope to see more of you in the future. Thanks again to the Historic Preservation Trust of Lancaster County for having me, and thanks to all of you for listening.